Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. This is Sher Ali Khan. It is a pleasure to have Faramarz Farbod, a native of Iran, teaches politics at Moravian College in Pennsylvania. He is the founder of the Beyond Capitalism Working Group and editor of its publication Left Turn. Across his Facebook commentary, Farbod has offered one of the most incisive and grounded critiques of U.S. empire, Zionism, and the collapse of liberal legitimacy. In this conversation, we speak about the meaning of Iran's recent war with Israel, the limitations of international law, the myth of U.S. diplomacy, and the larger unraveling of the empire's ideological control. We explore how the ceasefire reflects not peace, but a tactical collaboration by cornered empire, how liberalism masks violence through lawfare, and why U.S.-Israel alliance is waging a war not just on Iran, but on the possibility of a multipolar world. This is not a retrospective conversation. It is about what comes next. Watch, share, and support our work at buymeacoffee.com/organic filaments. Welcome to the show, Faramarz. How do I pronounce your name again?
You've done quite well. Faramarz is fine. Just one correction. Where I teach is Moravian University now. It used to be a college, but it has now become a university. Also, I'm editor, co-editor of Dissident Voice. Some of your maybe audience may be aware of it. If they check out the internet.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for asking. Very 100 degrees. We broke in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where I live, yesterday and the day before. We broke the heat record. I think 100-year record.
So before we go further, can you explain how we should understand Iran's political system today, not through the Western caricatures, but in its actual complexity? Iran is often described in U.S. media as a theocratic dictatorship. You've challenged this oversimplification while acknowledging authoritarian features. What kind of state structure are we really dealing with, and how does it function, especially during war or foreign aggression?
Thank you for that question. It's an important question. Yeah, Iran's political structure is, maybe you could say it's a hybrid political structure. It has elements of Republican/democratic participation or, institutions in it. And it also has parallel institutions that are given power by the religious establishment of Iran to have either overseeing responsibilities over the elected institutions or sometimes even have more power over them. So those institutions that are very important, for instance, is the institution, for instance, of the leadership. It's called supreme leader in the West, but we don't use that term in Iran. When we refer to Ayatollah Khamenei and prior to him, Ayatollah Khomeini, we just say the leader. Now, that leadership position has, you could say, the ultimate authority on matters of war and peace and national security and some domestic, let's say, issues as well. But we do have in Iran the office of presidency, which is elected. Iran, since its revolution in 1979, has had very regular electoral processes which have elected presidents from back in early 90s continuously till today. Then you have legislative, for instance, branch of Iran's government, and that again involves elections, public participation. But at the same time, you have another parallel institution like the Guardian Council, for instance, that has an ability to vet people who would want to, let's say, hold office or nominate themselves. It also has the ability to oversee legislation to see whether or not it meets the standards by which they judge legislation. And if it doesn't, the legislation can go back and forth between the Guardian Council and back to the legislators to make some amendments that might satisfy the Guardian Council. So they have these sorts of complicated mechanisms that are not something that Americans or North Americans or Europeans are familiar with. It's a cumbersome governing system, machinery, and it has produced limited, I would say, choices in areas that are important to the electorate, let's say, in the area of economics or foreign policy and stuff like that. And it's not surprising that it has limited choices for people because most electoral systems that I know of, including the one in the United States, has the same feature. Different mechanisms, but limited choices for the public. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in my mind when Westerners talk about Iranian system. First of all, they simplify it, as you mentioned, in terms of, it's a theocratic system, and they ignore the Republican aspects of it. And
Yeah.
secondarily, when they talk about Iran in this way, it's as if they're saying Iran's electoral system and the limited choices that it offers its public, it's unique. But they don't look in the mirror to see that they actually have the same kind of outcomes in their own electoral system for different reasons. For instance, in the US, you might say the vetting takes place by the donor class or the capitalist class. Those who own the country and own the resources of the country, they get to say in the final analysis, who gets to run and what policies are, the outcome of their electoral system.
We're speaking just after a U.S. brokered ceasefire ended, 12 days of bombing between Israel and Iran, an escalation that brought not only global attention to the limits of diplomacy, the collapse of international law, increasingly open warfare targeting the global South. What does this 12-day war reveal about the current state of the U.S. empire and its capacity to manage global conflicts?
Another good question. Well, I suppose I would begin by saying that the Euro-American imperialism is in decline. And one of the signs of its decline is that, for instance, it could have resolved the issue of Iran's nuclear so-called problem diplomatically, and it resorted to violence instead. And what we ended up with this situation where maybe 600 Iranians died, maybe even more, and many, many more were wounded. Iran's internal politics has now, I think, towards much more of a united public against the Euro-imperialist project. Now, none of these things should have happened if the empire had a consciousness of some form of rationality, let's say, that it could have achieved some of its goals without the cost that it now has incurred. So there's a problem with the imperial consciousness to begin with, which sees the world in terms of the colonial psyche, that, the colonizers will control the rest of the world and the rest of the world has to be subservient to them. That existed in the past in the long-term perspective about colonialism, but that it makes mistakes, that imposes cost on them increasingly on an accelerated rate, that I think could be viewed as a sign of weakness. So that's what I would say.
And there's a permanent, I guess you could say, encirclement that shapes Iran's posture in the region. And Iran is encircled by U.S. military bases across Qatar, Iraq, Kuwait, Afghanistan until recently, and the Persian Gulf. How does this permanent encirclement shape Iran's posture in the region? And what does resistance mean for a state under constant surveillance, sanctions, and threat of war?
Yeah, very difficult. Well, Iran is not stranger to anti-colonial forms of politics. And in fact, you might say that such perspectives developing in the 50s and 60s and 70s in the region and also in Iran, located in West Asia, were the grounds by which a revolutionary process toppled the old regime and established a post-revolutionary state in Iran. So Iran is quite familiar with forms of anti-colonial politics, whether they're like liberal anti-colonial politics or more radical anti-colonial politics of various kinds, Islamist or secular. So this is the background of Iran's consciousness, and there's nothing new there. Of course, inside Iran, it's a very complicated society, 90-some million people, vast territory, and subjected over the decades to a lot of broadcasting from abroad, including Iranian expats who lost, for instance, their wealth in Iran. They're monarchists and stuff and they would like to see changes. So there's a lot of impact on Iran's consciousness at the moment. And so there are divisions inside Iran as to how to go forward. There are segments of Iranian public, mostly like in northern parts of cities, more well-to-do areas, richer people, who would like to see a rapprochement with the West, and they would like to see foreign investment, European and American foreign investment, to be free to come inside Iran. They see their own economic interest tied with that sort of prospect. And at the same time, you have people who still adhere to the anti-colonial perspective and the traditions, and there's a back and forth between them. But I think the recent event, this 12-day war, have discredited the group that wants to see the rapprochement with the West, because now they saw the violence that could be visited upon them. And it's not over, obviously. We know that, for instance, the chief of staff of Israel has just said the other day that what we witnessed in the past 12 days was just one phase of their policies in relation to Iran, and this ceasefire is not going to last. Of course, we don't need the chief of staff's acknowledgement, because we also know from history of ceasefires with Israel that they will always violate these ceasefires. They've done so with Hamas in Gaza, and they've done so with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I think in their mind, the Lebanese and the Hamas model of ceasefire is what they are envisioning for Iran. So many Iranians are now coming to acknowledge these facts on the ground. But at the same time, I was just listening to another podcast with Iranians, and there are some voices that are now saying that perhaps what I just said about this consciousness shifting is true, but there might be a possibility in their mind that Trump is a different creature, that they might be able to please him by negotiating with him in the way he likes and giving him all the praise that he wants to, usually get from various people around him, including, for instance, let's say, because of what happened with the International Atomic Energy Agency with Iran right prior to the 12-day war. And apparently Iran said they had a cache of information that they obtained from the agency, and it showed that the agency was collaborating behind closed doors with Israel, and it was taking information from inside Iran, including locations of scientists and other things, and passing it to Israel. Israel then used it as target, to take them down in Iran. And so Iran is very upset about Grossi and the IAEA. So these people are now saying, well, maybe post ceasefire, Iran should not have any relationship with the IAEA anymore, but have a direct relationship instead with the Atomic Energy of the United States, associations of the United States. So direct negotiations with the U.S. Atomic Energy, so pleases Trump. So there's all sorts of things that are now shifting inside Iran. To answer your question about how Iran will respond, I don't see there's a singularity of opinion, although there is a consensus now more than ever based on, one, unity of purpose among Iranians to defend Iran against future attacks, and at the same time also a greater depth of understanding in terms of what Euro-American / Zionist, imperial projects might have in store for Iran.
I think you've also written that Iran is part of a broader arc of resistance, including Lebanon, Yemen, and Palestine, but it also faces political isolation. How does Iran navigate the contradictions of being both a state actor and a symbolic figure in the anti-US Israeli resistance?
No, I think you're right. Iran is obviously part of so-called axis, self-declared axis of resistance. And that, I think, should remain, if someone asks my opinion, because what matters in the West Asian politics, of course, the greatest old wound of that region is the plight of Palestinians. And one of the things that people like me appreciate about Iran's foreign policy is that in Iran's foreign policy, Palestine was central. Now, of course, the politics of Palestinian resistance to Israel has shifted over the decades from what it used to be a secular form of radical politics, opposing the Greater Israel Project and the ethnic cleansing and the genocidal project of Zionism, to more like a more like an Islamist orientation, but that's the way things have shifted, and Iran represents that pole. Now, outside of the axis of resistance issue, Iran, I think in the past 12 days during this episode of war between Iran and Israel, realized that it is very much in an isolated position when it comes to military alliances. And right now, today, I think in the United Nations, if you were paying attention, Chinese and Russian representatives were verbally placing themselves in favor of Iran and condemning Israel and United States, which is a good thing. But Iran also realized that in that 12-day period, no one really came to its aid militarily. And so that's something that Iran has to ponder, because all of its technical and defensive abilities mostly were indigenous and native developments to Iran. And of course, Iran is under sanctions. And so there's great restraints on how Iran can, let's say, rebuild its defenses without the alliances that it probably needs, I think, in terms of the race against time before the Israelis violate the ceasefire again and attempt to do something similar to Iran in the last 10 or 12 days that we've seen. So there's a lot of things for Iran to decide in terms of its orientation. What do we do with Trump as a unique president of United States, depending on what happens to Trump internally in the United States, because he's now under a lot of attack from various corners, including part of his own constituency, and also whether or not Iran would have to make a decision, much more decisive decision, to move towards and shift its policies and alliances much more securely towards the global south. And there's a division on that. People who say, yes, Iran should move more securely towards global south. And there are others who are saying, well, maybe Trump represents a different kind of opportunity. So we'll have to see what comes out of that.
You've mentioned that there's been a shift, and that's what you're describing, from strategic patience to active deterrence in terms of military strategy. How has Iran's military strategy evolved over the past decade, and why did it choose this moment to directly target Israeli infrastructure?
Yeah, Iran's long-term strategy militarily in terms of use or non-use of its military abilities was based on this, as you termed, strategic patience. Now, that was because it understood over the last couple of decades that Israel's interest was to provoke Iran into some kind of a military response that would then allow the United States to join Israel in attacking Iran, mostly for regime change purposes, which is what I think the intention of Israel is. And Iran understood that it doesn't want to respond in any kind of irrational way from its perspective that allows the Israelis to get the United States to join them to attack Iran. So for decades, Iran tolerated a lot of assassination of its scientists inside Iran, a lot of attacks by Israel, for instance, in Syria, where Iran's assets were deployed to Syrian country. In that situation, that's now different. But Iran tolerated that and did not make any kind of response until the last year, when Iran's embassy in Syria was attacked. And Iran, in the post-October 7 era, once attacked in this way, decided to respond. And that's why you had the first Iran's response, the promise number one response, that Iran actually portrayed its own ability or demonstrated its own ability to reach Israel, but deliberately didn't use its more modern missiles and deliberately didn't target sites that it could target. And it hoped that by demonstrating its ability, it would induce the other side to think that Iran has a deterrent ability. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, that didn't last long. And so Iran was forced into the situation to have another response in the number 2 honest promise that it named its operation. And it showed in that second attack that it can have greater ability to destroy targets in Israel and target them. And so we had that, but that didn't end the situation again. So we ended up with the last 12 days of war, which Iran was finally put in a position to show its hands in terms of its military abilities. And if you ask me, like, did the last 12 days demonstrate a deterrent standard for Iran? Did Iran establish a deterrent standard going forward? I would say no. But at the same time, to be fair, Iran did show that under very, very strained situations, because if you remember the first day of the last 12 days of the war, Iran was surprised under the attack and within the first few hours lost the top senior officials of the military, a bunch of other top scientists, nuclear scientists. And from inside Iran, we now know that Israel had penetrated inside Iran. Huge gaps in Iran's intelligence, maybe department, have to be now remedied because for months Israel was able to actually have clandestine sites of production, even of drones, for instance, small drones that were able to use in the first day of attack against Iran to target sites, military sites, launchers, etc. So from this perspective, Iran showed some gaps, but at the same time, when Iran used its missile technologies, I think it showed that its missile technologies, which are native constructions and production of Iran, it's a success. And to this moment, probably Iran didn't reveal all of its missile hands, thinking that violations of ceasefire will take place in the future, and Iran wants to phase by phase move in that direction. So there's a good thing about the missiles, the native missiles for Iran, but I don't think it established a deterrent standard. And I would expect in the future Israel continue to violate and possibly challenge Iran further into moving in that direction.
Sanctions have been central to U.S. policy towards Iran, not only economically but socially and politically. How do you respond to claims that sanctions are a non-violent way to promote political change, and what are the real effects inside Iran of the sanctions?
Yeah, I would disagree. Of course, to me, sanctions are essentially economic strangulation of a targeted country, and it's against international law as well, and it's a non-humane aspect of U.S. policy. Something like 34, I think, countries are under sanctions by the United States. Maybe if in terms of population numbers and size, probably about a third of the population of the world is under the policies of economic strangulation or economic warfare by the United States. And clearly it has terrible effects on the targeted population in wherever the United States has targeted these populations. For instance, in Venezuela, even data shows maybe 100,000 Venezuelans have died as a result of economic warfare that the United States has waged against them. Fortunately, in Iran, I don't think the scale of deaths are as proportionate to the size of the population, is not as bad as in the case of Venezuela. That's because maybe Iran is a much bigger country and much more powerful and has other countervailing factors involved in it. But that doesn't mean Iran itself wasn't and hasn't been subjected to an imposed economic cost on its development with sanctions. You could make good case of probably about maybe 20% additional cost in almost every economic activity that Iran engages in transactionally as a result of these sanctions policies. And of course, Iran's access to global markets is also restrained. But nevertheless, it hasn't stopped Iran, for instance, in developing its own native missile technology with lots of effort and investment. But it doesn't have to be this way, of course, now. So yeah, sanctions to me are criminal just as much as wars are, and it's just a different form of warfare.
You pointed out that Iranian opposition figures in the diaspora, particularly in the US, aligned with imperial interests under the guise of regime change. How do you distinguish principled opposition to Iran's internal repression from opportunistic calls for Western intervention?
Yeah, just to be more clear about this, not all Iranian expats fall into that category. But for instance, right now, in the past 12 days, Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former king, seems to be probably the biggest loser of the last 12 days if you're thinking about like the individuals who were associated with this 12 days of war, I think he's the biggest loser because he just came out in the middle of the attack against Iran and took a position essentially in favor of the attack on Iran and then called the Iranians to rise up. And none of that happened, of course. Iranians went the opposite direction. They unified and defended their country and saw him as someone who apparently doesn't even have the sense of understanding that by siding with the war against Iran, he is going to repeat what we've seen, for instance, from Iranian Mujahideen group, what's called the MEK, back in the 80s when they sided with Saddam Hussein in the latter years of Iran-Iraq war and attacked Iran and therefore lost all legitimacy in the eyes of most Iranians because you don't side with the country that's attacking your country, regardless of your grievances at home internal to Iran's politics. So now to the other part of your question, how do I distinguish between those who act like Reza Pahlavi, for instance, did in the past 12 days and those who might take a different position? Well, it's a simple thing. I mean, I can understand that many Iranians have grievances internal to Iran's politics. And what we need to have, of course, is clarity about what those grievances are, but never allowing your grievances with Iran's government to be used and manipulated by foreign powers who obviously have different objectives with Iran. So, and historically, Iran's enemy, of course, historically has been imperialism, goes back all the way to the early 1950s when Iran's first attempt at parliamentary democracy in relation to sovereignty over its own national resources, quote unquote, oil, was toppled by the MI6 and CIA, and that's Mohammad Mossadegh's, 1951-53 parliamentary governing system of Iran, and replaced by restoration of an increasingly autocratic king for the next 25 years. And of course, after the revolution, you had the same issues with Euro-American imperial postures vis-a-vis Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. Mostly they sided with the Iraqis. Beyond that, this continuous economic warfare against Iran with sanctions and all that. So anyone in Iran who takes their legitimate grievances with government, but allows these foreign governments, United States, and then, of course, Israel, to manipulate them into siding with attacks against Iran, whether they're in the form of hot war or in the form of, let's say, economic warfare or in the form of other versions of subversion, let's say, killing people and assassinating people, destabilizing the regime. I think that should be the red line.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would just say that, it's okay to have grievances about the government. And of course, the government would have to address them, respond to them. But that's one thing. And siding with people who are attacking Iran.
Revisit the question of the Iran's relationship or solidarity with Palestine. I feel that in a lot of your posts, you're making more of a tactical point. You're making more than a tactical point. You're making a moral one. Why does Palestine continue to shape Iran's international posture despite the costs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I may have a different answer than if you ask a government official, for instance, or a state official. I think to take their point of view first, one of the, let's say, principal pillars of the revolutionary struggles that led to the downfall of the last dynasty in Iran, Pahlavi dynasty, and established the Islamic Republic soon thereafter, was solidarity with Palestine. So from the beginning, both the secular left in Iran in the 70s and then the religious left in Iran had Palestine in their eyesight as a central, let's say, concern. And so it's not surprising that the post-revolutionary state in Iran has continued that perspective. Now, there's other dimensions. There are other dimensions to this. For one, maybe one important dimension is that also the post-revolutionary state in Iran saw its solidarity with Palestine as a way of endearing itself to the Arab world, to the Arab street. Because, of course, Palestine is an Arab question. as well. The Palestinian question is an Arab question. And as you know, Iranians are Persians mostly, and they're not Arab, but because of their solidarity with Palestine, that's one way that Iran can actually enter the consciousness of the so-called Arab masses, especially when the Arab leaders themselves are reactionary and either, I guess, give lip service to Palestine question, or behind the doors are actually collaborating with American imperialism and Zionism. So in light of the deficiency or the betrayal of the Arab leaders, and in light of the fact that Iran is not an Arab state, this issue of Palestine allows the post-revolutionary state to endear itself in the region that it belongs to large masses of people, and not just limit itself and its revolutionary project to the Iranian geography.
You've described this current conflict, the 12-day war, not merely as absurd, but deeply revealing. From your perspective, what political and ideological contradictions or crises are being exposed by the escalation and its aftermath?
Well, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer because I think the situation is very fluid now. And it's easier to talk about what happened in the last 12 days than what we might see in the next couple of months, which are probably very crucial. So how Iran responds to this 12 days in the next 2 months reveal whether or not some of the contradictions that may have existed or differences of approaches and opinion and all that are faithful or not in terms of what will now be seen the long term in Iran. For instance, is Iran's state now in a shape to address the gaps, for instance, an intelligence gap that we saw, the penetration of Iran's territory by Israeli Zionist agents using probably some Mujahideen or MEK people and some maybe people upset at some ethnic policies of Iran, maybe the Kurds or others maybe. Is Iran able to deal with those contradictions in its own system of rule and some of the deficiencies that it had existed in the past in terms of maybe not spending enough of its resources on some areas in Baluchistan or other parts of Iran, etc. So let's put that aside for the moment. But going forward, there's the discussion also in Iran in terms of like, how do we now deal with the question of Iran's nuclear capacity? Can Iran maintain, for instance, a position of we will not allow anyone to dictate to us that you cannot have enrichment of uranium in Iran? If you insist on enrichment of uranium, does that mean that the division that, for instance, seems to be taking place between United States and Israel, because Israel might want to have a regime change in Iran, but United States may not want to see regime change, just want to deal with so-called the nuclear issue and the enrichment issue. Now, if Iran says we will have enrichment and we will not accept zero enrichment, does that mean that that allows the United States to once more give green light to Israel to attack Iran the second time? So there are like issues like that. What do you do with the nuclear issue? What do you do with Iran's missile technology? We don't know. That's what I'm saying. It's fluid. Now, for instance, it's hard for me to assume that post 12-day war, Iran's government will accept any restriction on its missile technologies. Whereas it seems like some people in Washington and certainly Israel want to go to next phase of their demand beyond nuclear and say Iran must not have missile technologies. Now, that's a huge red line for Iran. And in fact, it might be viewed as the last line of defense of Iran. I can't see any, for instance, politician in Iran to accept no missile native technologies inside Iran and be able to, in fact, have 2 days of possibility of ruling in Iran. People will just object to that. So to answer your question, it's kind of difficult because there's so many different situations and fluid situations that are taking place on the matter of either regime change or missile technologies, nuclear issue, and etc. I don't know if
Can
I
you speak
answered
a
that.
little bit about the hypersonic missile response?
Mm-hmm.
You spoke very highly about that. in response to the Israel attacks in terms of self-defense and sovereignty and those things. Um, what is your perspective on that technology, and what did it demonstrate about Iran's military and political posture during the conflict?
Yeah. Well, in the past 70 some years, Israel has never suffered what it suffered in the last 10, 12 days with increasingly more advanced versions of Iran's missile technology being used in the latter 6 or 7 days of the 12 days war, hitting Tel Aviv, hitting Haifa, hitting targets that Iran actually had figured out as strategic, like, the oil refinery of Haifa was hit. For instance, Mossad headquarters were hit. The, Weizmann Institute of Science was hit. That kind of damage that was done to Israel was never experienced by Israelis. And in fact, it's, I think, very damaging to the psychology of Israelis, because Israelis actually have a colonial psyche. And what the colonial psyche is that it thinks that it can conquer other people, wage wars against them, but never incur cost at home. It's always like a one-way violence from the colonial centers to the colonized. And I think in the last 12 days, Iran reversed that with its hypersonic missiles. And for the first time, the colonial psychology of Israelis was revealed as, I guess, problematic in their context. And the fact that Israelis, for instance, also not just in terms of the damage that these missiles cause, but also in terms of the fact that most Israelis had to live in shelters in the past 12 days and come out of the shelters and go back in the shelters, sweat in the shelters, never knew whether or not they can have their, routine of their lives, go to work and do the things that they want to do, have a normal life while they're bombing other countries, that kind of idea. That was decimated. So no matter what happens in terms of whether Iran accommodates later to the demands of Israel or the United States, whether Iran survives as a state, even, I'm going that far even. No matter what happens, this 12 days shattered that colonial psyche, and it may also have had something to do with the news reports that say Israel demanded ceasefire from the United States to intervene and have a ceasefire, because Israel wants a breathing space from what it just experienced in terms of the costs imposed on it. Of course, Iran suffered more. There's no doubt about that in terms of numbers of deaths and stuff. But it is a unique thing when a colonial center like Israel experiences versions of Gaza inside its own cities and Tel Aviv. And so the missile technology of Iran was very unique, I think, feature of the past 12 days. And that's why in one of my Facebook posts, I said, like in a soccer match, when they say, who's the man of the match or the person of the match, I would look back at the 12 days and I say Iran's hypersonic missiles was one. Now, if I were to nominate a second factor as like person of the match or whatever, using that metaphor, I would also say Iranian public, because blitzkrieg in the first day, I think, was meant to confuse Iranian state, take out its senior leadership, military and scientists, and also disallow Iran to have an ability to respond, and hoped that the people would rise up. And what didn't happen was the people didn't rise up, and the opposite happened. So maybe that's the second man of the match. The public came together in defense of Iran rather than rise up as the Israelis expect.
I think this relates to something I read in Michael Zeldis Roth's article in Common Dreams. He argues that Netanyahu's government is weaponizing civilian fear to shore up political legitimacy. Do you see this conflict as exposing both the fragility of empire and a fundamental crisis within Zionism itself on a certain level? I also do feel that it's also taken away attention from the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And I wonder how you see it, in terms of these questions.
No, I think it's the latter part of your question actually is the key. Israel had always used Iranophobia, if you want to put it this way, as a way of distraction from what it's doing to Palestinians. And in fact, that's the function of Iran in terms of the Zionist Israelis for decades. Always been like that. In my mind, sometimes it has raised a question as to like whether Israel actually wants regime change in Iran. Because if, let's say, regime change takes place and Israel is actually able to create a Zionist Iran, let's say after a regime change, a Zionist regime in Iran, then Israel will deprive itself of using Iranophobia to mobilize global public opinion and shift it towards Iran rather than seeing what it's doing to Palestinians in terms of its ethnic cleansing and genocidal policies. And essentially like erasure of Palestine. This is what Israel is fundamentally interested in. So sometimes I question, does Israel really want that? Because it needs that distraction that Iran serves as a function. So, that's one comment I would make. Now, of course, you have to be able to explain to some extent why Israel is doing to Iran, for instance, what the past 12 days represented. If Israel is not interested in regime change, what is it interested in? Why is it attacking Iran? Is it just a matter of nuclear issues? No, I don't believe that. I think maybe enough people in Israel have decided that post October 7, a possibility of what at least I think Netanyahu and some other officials have repeatedly said, a new Middle East. They have referred to that. Now, it could be that post October 7, that restraining factor about maybe we don't want a Zionist Iran because we need it we need Iranophobia in our manipulation of global public opinion. Maybe that has shifted. Maybe they have realized that October 7 gave them an opportunity to erase Gaza and resolve the issue of Palestine in a decisive way that doesn't even require in the future, long-term future, Iranophobic function for a state in Iran to perform. And so if that is the case, assuming that might be the case, what Israel might want from Iran is no longer like a Zionist Iran, because that's not even rational. Public opinion in Iran doesn't support any Zionist friendly government post Islamic Republic anyway. So what you might want is not regime change in Iran in the old sense, but regime chaos or regime breakup, as the US might have pondered regime behavior change. So there's these kind of like different scenarios that open themselves in terms of possibilities. Does the US want just regime behavior change in terms of like nuclear weapons and this and that, or maybe missiles? But is that what Israel wants, or Israel is actually seeking breakup of Iran? And you could also say that the Israeli version of a breakup of Iran has an old tradition behind it, because Israel doesn't want any powerful state in West Asia that is a sovereign state. And you could say the sin of Iran in both Israeli and US perspective, here they come together, is Iran is a sovereign state. And because Iran obviously is large and has strategically positioned geography and also has resources, oil and stuff, sovereignty means accountability to your own people. And accountability to your own people is at odds with being a component of empire. Component of empire means that you can't be accountable to your own people. Your resources and your policies have to be aligned with the imperial agenda. So, there are all these kind of like strands here.
I want to return to something you mentioned earlier, the IAEA resolution, which was passed hours before the bombing began. And Medea Benjamin and Nicholas Davies from Code Pink, they wrote in Z Magazine recently describing it as diplomatic cover for war. How should we understand the role of international institutions like the IAEA and the UN, which are supposed to be tools of diplomacy, or are they just simply mechanisms for enabling US imperialism or imperial violence?
Yeah, I'd say the simple answer is yes. One of the features of late capitalist, imperialist stage that we're living through is that all international institutions, and in fact, international law, is sacrificed at the altar of imperial agenda. And I don't see any trend reversing it.
Mhm.
We can't even speak about international law, certainly post October 7 and the genocide of 600, whatever, 30 some days plus genocide that it's happening in front of our eyes, live streaming, and there's no
Yeah.
possibility that any kind of international institutions are able to do anything, including the International Criminal Court or Court of Justice, regardless of even the fact that they've said this is a plausible, ruled that this is a plausible genocide that's going on, and even maybe warrants for arrest of Netanyahu and others. But there's no chance that powers that be, that is Washington, actually allows international law and norms to be applied, regardless of the decisions that are made by some of these institutions. The reason is because we have a contrast between a law-based international order that would have been, let's say, the United Nations preamble or United Nations charter, etc., versus what's often called the rules-based international order. But the rules-based international order is the US rules-based international order, which is at odds with the law-based international orders. I don't think we should have any illusion. So we live under the rules-based, not the law-based. And the laws, to the extent that they're used selectively, and they're used against states that attempt to have some independence in relation to the Euro-imperial project, and never against states that are willing components of that empire, regardless of how much atrocities they engage in.
And you've also spoken about the failure of manufactured consent in this moment. Why did media and public buy-in collapse this time? What does the shift say about current US imperial legitimacy?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that every, especially young person in the West and the US, has a thing called cell phone in their hands. And since October 7th, they've been inundated with all sorts of images of horrible brutality by Israel done to Palestinians in Gaza. And the impact of these images are huge. So Israel and Zionism and Euro-American backing for it and complicity in the genocide, they have lost, you might say, the battle of images, because your cell phone shows that. Everyone sees that. In fact, that's why, for instance, the US establishment is angry at and wants to do something about TikTok to get rid of it or control it so these images are not contradicting the narratives of the Western imperial project or the powers that be. So you could say there are two battles, the battle of narratives and the battle of images. There's no doubt the Israeli Zionist US empire have lost the battle of images. Now, the battle of narratives is still up for grabs, but I think your question moves us in maybe assessing that. And I think in the battle of narratives, they're also losing because the images have been so harrowing and so steady for so many days. We're not talking about like a 10-day genocide period or a month that people can now forget. You're talking about 630, whatever, 5 days of it. And it's, unbelievably, incredibly has moved into like using starvation as a weapon of choice. And as of last week, for instance, heard that they're now using thirst as a way to kill Palestinian children and others by just
What is fascinating is you also elucidated or exposed the fact that we weren't just watching genocidal war, right? In terms of Gaza and, the 12-day war, but a rupture in empire, a moment where everything can be questioned on a certain level. And do you think there's something in that which we can hold on to as young people or people who are looking for alternatives?
Well, it depends on what we do. The young generation, a lot of history and its trajectory has to do with what actually end up people doing. So if we sit back and watch these things, no. Empire has shown resilience and it has a lot of resources at its disposal. The intelligentsia is on their side. In fact, one of the problematic features, if we focus on the United States, for instance, of late capitalist, let's say, decline of empire is that the decision-making institutions of the United States have insulated themselves against public pressure from below.
That's
Now,
true.
That's a negative thing from the perspective of, let's say, me, who wants to see changes, humane changes, wants to see empire dismantle. And I'm old enough to remember that when I was, let's say, your age, a lot of emphasis among activists, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist activists, was try to change public opinion. And the assumption there was if the public is aware or becomes more aware, then it can use its energies and pressures to change policy from above. Now, I think that assumption is pretty much nullified by events, because as the ability of activists and events in the world have led to changes in perceptions of the public, the decision makers and the elites have also insulated themselves further from the ability of the public to pressure them. So we are at this very odd moment that more and more people see the world the way you and I are seeing it, and including in the United States. But at the same time, they have much less ability to influence decision making because of the insulation of policy making from the above. And sometimes in the literature of political science, that's called like democracy deficiency, or some version of that terminology. So how do we deal with that? How are we supposed to go beyond raising awareness of the public and changing the institutions of power that make those decisions? Those are very critical questions that needs to be raised at this moment. And I don't see any other way you need to have disruptive, I think disruptive protest movements, and disruptive in strategic sense. For instance, if you're dealing with genocide in Gaza, it doesn't make sense to produce 400,000 people demonstrating in Washington, D.C. in a weekend, and then they go back home. That doesn't apparently do much. What you need to do is, like, for instance, get certain segments of the labor movement, let's say, to align itself with this anti-genocide policy and have, let's say, workers in ports refuse to deal with ships that carry materials to Israel, either to take materials off the ship or put on the ship. If you could,
general strikes, like general strikes and those sort of things.
General strike would be great, but even like refusal of labor to participate in ports to deal with a war situation or a genocide in Gaza or something, those are like the critical strategic nodes that disruptions would make great amount of sense. And from the capitalist perspective, if you hit them hard in their pocket, which is like disruption of commerce and disruption of accumulation of capital here and there, those are the kind of things that I think we need to participate now or think about in order to get beyond this insulation of decision makers from public pressure that's exerted in traditional forms of protest.
You've also written about the U.S. not being a republic, let alone a democracy. You've called it a rogue state led by a depraved ruling class and aided by fully subservient intelligentsia. What is the nature of the American state and, in its relation to Israel? Like, how do you view it in terms of imperialism and those things?
Well, yeah, first of all, I mean, a republic, the idea of a republic, there's two different things. There's a republic and democracy. And most people understand that the United States is not a democracy, even though in the statements of politicians and, pundits on TV or whatever, people always say American democracy. But everyone that studied history of the United States and Constitution of the United States knows that we are deliberately not a democracy. We're supposed to be a republic. And the idea of republic is such that somehow through, let's say, representational forms of politics and voting, the will of the public in some way gets to be influential in the decision of the decision makers. I mean, that's the idea of basically like republicanism in the United States. Now, I say United States is not a republic because you take, for instance, what is the most important decision that any political system faces? That's usually the question of war and peace. Yeah. And so you take that as an example and say, okay, in the question of war and peace, to what extent when the U.S. engaged itself, let's say, in attacking Iran, last 2 weeks, did it engage in any kind of public deliberation about that decision? There was no public deliberation.
It did not.
Was there any kind of deliberation that took place in the Congress among the legislative branch of the United States about this attack on Iran? The answer is no, zero, zilch. Now, and who made the decision, therefore? The decision was made by few people in the executive branch of the United States, with possibly, from what we hear reports, agents of Israel and Zionist Israel debriefing the president of the United States with uh, horrendously exaggerated, apparently, stories telling the president of the United States that if you don't attack Iran, don't join United Israel in this war, Iran will be able to have nuclear weapons within a week and pass it to Yemenis, the Ansarullah, so-called Houthis. I mean, that's a kind of like stories that now we hear that took place in the closed doors of the executive branch between some Zionist, officials allowed there and talking with a few people who made decisions. So in what sense does that tell us that this is a republic? When the most important decision that it can make about war and peace is made by few people without any deliberation on the public or the representatives of the public in the Congress. So that's why I wrote that what is obvious to me, this is not a republic. And when you engage in a war of aggression against another country, unprovoked, Iran, never attacked the United States, really. There was no threat of Iran attacking the United States. In fact, Iran and the United States were engaging in a negotiation, the sixth round of which was about to begin 2 days before the United States gave green light to Israel to attack Iran. When a state acts this way, this is a textbook definition of being a rogue state. I mean, I'm just saying what is observed by, I think, by anyone, if observed by anyone, must be acknowledged without any kind of hesitation. Your other part of your question was, had to do with the United States and Zionism. But that relationship between the United States and Israel goes back in time, obviously, and we don't want to delve in all the details of history, but perhaps I should say that since 1967, when there was that so-called six-day war, Israel demonstrated to the United States that as a military power, it can decimate what United States empire at that time in West Asia was very concerned about, and that was Nasserism, Egypt's Nasser. And Nasser represented the idea of unity of Arabs together, bringing in their material, natural resources and their intellectual and political resources together to create an Arab bloc, not unlike what you would see, for instance, in European Union, but that would bring this Arab bloc into modernity, to a situation of greater power in unity, and use the resources for Arab prosperity. The United States attempted to undo that for a decade and a half, and it wasn't really able to until Israel demonstrated that it can defeat it militarily. And once Nasserism was defeated by Israel, the United States realized that this alliance between the United States and Israel would be very strategic, that Israel can become a dependable and dependent military, let's say, branch of U.S. empire in West Asia. And it can be used against all forms of Arab nationalism that's independent of empire. So from 1967 till now, this is exactly the position that the United States had taken. So Israel is a component of U.S. empire. Of course, Zionism has its own agenda, independent of the United States. For instance, there might be differences between what certain segments of U.S. elites want to see in relation to Palestine. Maybe U.S. elites would be okay with, conquering of Palestinian territories, whereas Israel might not even want a neo-colonial relationship to Palestinians. It wants to see them erased. In terms of like greater Israel. So there might be like differences between factions of U.S. imperialism and other factions of hardcore Zionism, and we might see that in the future. But nevertheless, we won't see that there's a divorce between them, because post 67 Israel is a component of U.S. empire, and its function is against any form of independence movement in West Asia.
Increasingly, there has been a growing debate amongst scholars of the left across the global south, such as people like Vijay Prashad, who have been arguing that this is part of a broader war on multipolarity, resisting US hegemony, including China and Russia. How do you situate the current circumstances in terms of Iran and Palestine in the broader geopolitical struggle over the global South and the future of global order.
No, I agree with, actually, I do agree with Vijay Prashad on this. I do see that the BRICS Plus project is seen by United States decision makers or policymakers or strategists as hugely problematic in terms of maintenance of U.S. hegemony going forward. And so they will do everything possible in order to create obstacles on the pathway of BRICS Plus becoming more powerful and the de-dollarization movements and all that kind of stuff. And central to that is China. I think probably China is the strongest element of the BRICS Plus. First, because of its increasing economic prowess and development, which is, for everyone to see, no one can deny that China is a rising economic power. I don't think China wants to be seen as a, let's say, ideological or geostrategic challenge to the United States at the moment. It sees itself as a rising economic power, and it can expand its influence around the world by using the Belt and Road, for instance, policy and trade policies and stuff like that. But nevertheless, the United States, I think in the end, wants to isolate and prevent the development of Chinese economic rise to power. And Iran, I think, in that situation represents an important element of the BRICS, assuming that Saudi Arabia will not join BRICS anytime soon. So Iran and its energy resources are part of the BRICS. And I think by disrupting that, United States would be playing its game in disrupting the rise of the BRICS. Multipolarity is a very important issue in terms of relationship to the U.S. hegemony that had been running the world for a while. And from the U.S. perspective, I think they do see multipolarity as something that they need to disrupt as a process, challenge. And to them, China is a key to be challenged and disrupted. China is a rising economic power and has the ability to not necessarily to provide the rest of the world with a model, although that is also there. There's a model that Chinese economic growth provides for the people, but the fact that Chinese, you might see from the United States perspective, tentacles of Chinese economic development are now global. It's a problem to the extent that China can make these deals with the rest of the world, economic deals, trade and otherwise. That means the U.S. interest, economic interest, is becoming more and more limited. From a capitalist perspective, this multipolarity and Chinese rise to power and BRICS Plus may represent disruption of certain capital accumulation processes that the U.S. capital is involved in, and certainly they don't want to see that. So this pivot to Asia that was explicitly stated by Obama's administration and Clinton at that time in 2011 tells us certainly that that is what the U.S. is concerned about. Of course, since then, the U.S. have been entangled in NATO war against, in a European context against, Russia, and then now in West Asia with Iran and Israel. These are entanglements that you could see them either as separate from this interest about BRICS Plus and multipolarity, or maybe as integral part of it. So some people argue that maybe the NATO-US war against Russia using Ukraine is part and parcel of weakening the BRICS, because Russia is obviously an important part of the BRICS Plus. And once they weaken Russia, they can move on to China. Beyond that, obviously that hasn't happened because Russia hasn't been really weakened. Is the victor of the Ukraine war from what I can see. So that didn't work. And the situation with West Asia and Iran could be seen in that integrated way as well, because Iran's resources, natural resources, oil and gas, are central to the BRICS Plus. If Iran is a full member, let's say, of BRICS Plus. So disrupting that, changing that, maybe regime change or regime behavior change or regime chaos or breakup of Iran would mean that Iran exits the BRIC Plus. And that's another way of weakening the BRICS Plus. So this is beyond like the Zionist let's say, goals vis-a-vis Iran. This is Washington's goals vis-a-vis Iran. So there are those layered differences. Yeah, so I agree. We should be able to see these conflicts in light of the decline or the challenges to U.S. hegemony by this sort of multipolarity. And of course, one last comment about multipolarity. I would like to see this BRICS Plus challenge capitalist ways of organizing the global economy rather than just creating a room for these states to play a different kind of a game or sit at a table with the US and sort of reduce US hegemony by forcing it to accept different voices. That's a different kind of multipolarity that I like to see. I like to see an anti-capitalist multipolarity and not just a multipolarity that aims to have a space at the table, a chair at the table. So that's what I would say.
You've also been sharply critical of liberal West's complicity. What urgent lessons should people in the US and Europe take from their government's actions and their own responsibilities in the current context?
Well, you mean responsibility vis-a-vis what? The liberal West responsibility in relation to
Relation to their own state's actions and those things?
well, I mean, there's so much there to discuss in terms of like foreign policy. I mean, for instance, there's a lot of talk in liberal democracies about their foreign policy is based on defense of democracies abroad against authoritarianism and all that kind of stuff. But we know that both Israelis and United States, for instance, have had a good relationship with, let's say, fundamentalist Islamic movements, which are anything but liberal in their perspective. We know that, for instance, from with U.S. participation in the Afghani jihadi wars, including Pakistan, for instance, who was involved. Saudi Arabia was involved for different reasons. Of course, each one of them had their own so-called national interests when they participated in the jihadi wars in Afghanistan. Well, the jihadi wars meant that these countries were involved in backing and arming and training of very retrograde Islamist forces against the Afghanistan's government, which was at that time pro-Soviet Union and was maybe Communist Party or something involved in it. So this kind of liberal so-called democracies, foreign policies that are actually work against radical Arab, independent, nationalist, socialist governments or movements, not just in the Arab world, but of course, globally, we have the record of US imperialism dealing with, any kind of independence or democratically movement or oriented states, including like, Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. Sabotaging the same kind of governments in Africa, like Patrice Lumumba's, all the way up to his assassination, of course, with the help of Belgium in, Congo, 1960. In Chile, the Allende government was a socialist government that was toppled by United States, coup making. In Brazil, Goulart in 1964. I mean, we have so many examples. Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. For the citizens of these liberal democracies to just become aware of how their government policies have become really counter-revolutionary um, uh, in terms of objecting to opposing independence movements, decolonization movements around the world. I mean, these are like crucial things for people in the United States and the rest of the world to become aware of and do something about. So, I mean, that's what I would say coming from an anti-imperialist perspective. There's so much at stake here. I mean, you could say that imperialism the past 500 years was the dominant force that shaped global politics. And then in the last 100 or 150 years, decolonization movements were equally important in reshaping the global landscape of politics. And most citizens of European and American states are completely unaware of these two shaping powers, imperialism and decolonization processes that have shaped the landscape of politics as we speak, and they're just like sleepwalking in a way.
Finally, what political questions or contradictions or are occupying your own work or thoughts or uh, analysis moving forward? Do you have any projects that you're working on or anything of that nature? that you'd like to share?
Well, in terms of my own project, well, I've always been imperialist in my perspective. So that goes on, and I don't see any way right now or any reason to abandon that. Certainly, what's going on with the country of my origin, where I was born, Iran, that brings me even more closer to the subject of anti-imperialism, because now I can see that Iran is in a position today that actually is in more danger of being dismantled or attacked, or the country breaking up. I've been listening or paying attention to some of the news that comes out that Israel, for instance, is looking into making connections with separatist movements in parts of Iran, like Azerbaijan, southern Azerbaijan. They want to make sure that maybe portions of Iran rise up in Azerbaijan and southern Azerbaijan joins northern Azerbaijan, and parts of the territory of Iran, for instance, is broken up to these pieces. I'm pretty much certain that Israel at this moment wants to see the breakup of Iran. So if you're asking me personally right now, what is my most intense attention and interest going to be, is going to be figuring out how to combat the forces at work that are intensifying their campaigns to break up this ancient country called Iran into pieces, knowing that they can't create a Zionist regime in Iran, because that's just not what the people will accept. So the best choice now they have is just to break it up or create chaos. And so I can't see anything else in taking up my attention aside from Palestine, because to me, Palestine is also very dear. So I have these two projects: make sure Palestine is not erased, and make sure Iran is not broken up into tiny little statelets and chaotic situations.
Sending lots of love and solidarity to you and your family. I'm hoping we can stay in touch. And thank you for appearing on this episode of the Organic Filaments Network. And thank you to our audience for watching this episode of the Organic Filaments Network. If you found this conversation meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. You can support the project at buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Every contribution helps us keep publishing critical voices and principled resistance. Until next time, stay grounded and stay rebellious. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.